Hey everyone, I'm rather Incoherent. We have an upcoming balance patch with a bunch of buffs and a few nerfs. We got a teaser for it today. We finally have confirmation as to what cards are getting changed. And I think the most interesting thing here is just the entire Death Knight class. So I'm going to go through all the cards getting buffs, all the cards getting nerfs, and see how I expect them to change. Let's go through buffs first. We have Rockmaster Voon for Warriors along with several other cards. Rockmaster Voon is hard to predict how he's going to get buffed because you could buff him in almost any way. I think the most likely buffs are that he goes down to 3 mana or that he goes up to being a 4 mana 4/5. He might gain Rush, he might gain Taunt. You could add pretty much anything to this card without overpowering it, and it would seem like it was still in line with the identities it's supposed to be in. Next up, we've got the Verse Riff, and as well, we also have the Bridge Riff right after it. I think these are pretty simple. I think they're both just to be a 1 mana buff. I think Verse Riff's going to go down to 1, and Bridge Riff right after it is going to be going down to 5. These cards were just overcosted. The reason the Bridge Riff package, or rather the Riff package, which capitalizes on Bridge Riff, doesn't work is because the package is just overcosted. Your synergies don't matter if the baseline cards are unplayable trash. Next up, we have the Power Slider, and just like Voon, there's a bunch of ways you could buff this. It could gain a health, it could gain an attack and a health, honestly, but I think that might be a bit too much. And it could be reduced an entire mana, which again, I think might be too much. I'm leaning towards, since they're doing so many buffs that they're all gonna be small iterative changes, so I would expect this to become a 3 mana 1/3. I don't think it's gonna get too much more of a buff than that, because typically when I was playing Menagerie Warrior, Power Slider wasn't the problem, it was everything else. Power Slider was a perfectly fine payoff, it's just the deck was so bad that it needed a bigger payoff. So if they just keep buffing Power Slider till the deck works, then they're really putting the entire class's power curve beyond one card. So I'm expecting to see a relatively minor buff here, and I think making it a 1/3 makes it a much more valuable tool to trade. Putting it on 2 mana makes it come out way too fast in later turns. I think 1 health is probably where it's going to fall. Next, we have Frightened Flunky, and if ever there has been a minion that was going to get +1 health for its buff, it's this one, right? A 2 mana 2/2 taunt is just understated garbage. Discovering a top minion is very, very low impact. It's just a tremendously worse version of draw a card, right? So I expect this to gain a health because as it stands, it's getting traded by cards with objectively better effects like Harbinger of Winter and Chillfall and Baron. There's not a reason to run this because its job, early game taunt minion, is done so poorly, especially against stuff like Pure Paladin where the, Sanguine Soldier. While this card is in a competitive deck, you cannot be running 2 mana 2/2 taunts in a deck seriously. It's way too bad. The only buff I can imagine for Frightened Flunky is +1 health. Next up we have Shield Block, and this could just be gaining more armor, go up to 8 to match Heavy Blade in a way. That would make sense. Honestly though, I sort of expect, since Control Warrior is in such a terrible spot, to see Shield Block going down to 2 mana. I sort of get, serious classic vibes from Shield Block in a way, like with Flame Imp and Voidwalker, where even though it can fit into a competitive deck, it feels like one of the worst cards in that deck. Shield Block today at 3 mana feels so bad, and maybe it'll feel good enough at gain 8 armor, right? Maybe it just needs a bit more armor to feel good, but I could see it just going down to 2 mana as well. I'm not sure which I would expect. Next up we have Thori'Belore. It's a 4 mana 4/4 with 2 revives right now, and any of that stuff can be changed. You could probably pump this card pretty hard without overpowering it, but it does strike me that the weak thing about Thori'Belore is that there's only one of them in your deck and there's not that many fire spells, so it's not actually super reliable. And that's not something you can buff, that's just the nature of the cards right now. Next up for Mage, we have the Spite Lash Siren, and I just forgot this card existed. It's gonna go down to 4 mana, right? If you bump it to 3 attack, it's still irrelevant, right? Fen Creeper stat line is not what this thing needs. I imagine that this will go down to 4 mana. It'll probably drop to maybe it won't even drop health. I was thinking it would drop to 5 health, but maybe it won't. Anyway, I can't imagine this thing's stat line getting buffed to the point where it's just a relevant body. So I assume it just goes down in mana to try to better enable its archetypes. I could be wrong. I honestly don't know what this card needs because I've never seen anyone even try to play one before. Next, we have Infinitized the maxitude, and I mean, there's not a lot of buffs you can give this card, so it's pretty obvious to me which buff it's getting. It's going to 1 mana, and it's going to be much, much better at 1 mana. Because I mean, what are you going to do? Discover 2 spells? Remove the finale? The only way to preserve the card's current identity and function and buff it is to reduce its mana to 1, so I'm pretty sure that's the change we'll be getting. Next up we have Arcane Artificer, and I mean, pretty obviously the only buff this thing will be getting that makes any sense is 1 more health. It could theoretically become a 2/2, that would be real weird, but since it's a defensive drop and not any way in a tempo deck, I'm going to be assuming it goes up to 3 health. Next up we have a card I wasn't expecting to see on the buff list, it's the Audio Splitter, but realistically I think it does deserve the buff because it's pretty unplayable in its current state. In virtually every deck, copying the highest cost spell in your hand is a big hoop to jump through. There are some decks where you cap out at the thing you want to do, but light show decks run volume up and you never have the time to play 2 volume ups. The card ends up being so clunky that its offensive stat line doesn't make sense unless you top out on like Fireball, right? And Fireball is not a card that's easy to put in a deck these days. So I fully expect this thing to just have its stat line reworked or just completely change the minion entirely. Theoretically, it could just be copy a spell in your hand. I think that would actually make the card less interesting and preserve its problems, because like you can still just randomly copy the stuff that you don't want, right? Your light show deck can still randomly copy volume up and you never have the time to play it. So I do realistically expect this to be a stat line change, but I'm not sure what it would be. Turning into Spider Tank isn't making it suddenly playable, right? I'm gonna be upfront with you, I honestly don't know what the change is here. I cannot tell you how you make Audio Splitter a better card. No, I can. You make it Spider Tank. I can't tell you how you buff Audio Splitter enough to make it relevant. I honestly don't know what to expect for the change here. Stranglethorn Heart's getting a buff. I'm going to go out on a limb here. The buff's probably that it no longer costs 10 mana, right? What else could you do to improve the card? Nothing, right? You can't make its effect better. Its effect is already as good as the effect can be. So presumably then this card is just going to drop down to 9, maybe even 8 mana, right? Because this card in its current state, I've never seen it get played. I've never lost against Big Beast Hunter, and I've never seen this card get played. It needs a buff. I'm not sure going to 8 or 9 will be enough, but there's literally no reason not to just buff it straight to 8 mana. They might only go to 9, they might be worried about it, but worrying about Big Beast Hunter sounds crazy, so I honestly expect to see this go straight to 8. We're also seeing a buff to Halderon Brightwing, and this is a card I've never seen played, but I actually have been like, oh hey, that's a cool idea for a deck, and I've tried to theory craft, and I've been like, oh, that doesn't work at all. The problem here is like, what do you do to this card to make it better, right? You could rework it as like an overstated 2-drop, right? Just make it a full-on 2-mana 3/3. You could just make it a 2-mana 2/3 to get the effect earlier, because you would want the effect earlier. There's no way it's spell damage +2, right? That's too much. You could also amend the text to draw a spell to the end of this. That would make it way, way stronger. I'm not sure how I expect to see this changed. I'm not... Like, the problem with the deck is the whole deck, right? It's not just Halderon Brightwing needs a buff. And I'm not sure what buff to Halderon Brightwing is intended here to try to elevate that deck archetype. There's also one last thing they could do. I'm gonna guess this is what the buff is, but honestly, Brightwing buff is going to be something I can't really predict, because it's going to be a very severe change to the card no matter what they do. Like, they're not just going to make it a 2-mana 3/4. They're not going to make it a 3-mana 3/5. This persisting on the board doesn't matter. Giving it more attack doesn't matter. Whatever change they make to Brightwing is going to be a big fundamental change to the way the card works, such as reimagining it entirely as an overstated 2-drop. And the change that I'm going to lean towards is give all arcane spells in your deck spell damage +1 and draw an arcane spell. I don't know what to expect from them, but I think the thing that keeps their identity intact the most while directly buffing them is that additional text. But I think that's wrong, because if they were going to make that change, Black Rock and Roll should have been on the buff list with the same change. So I'm not really sure what they're doing here. Also, Black Rock and Roll, notably not on the list. Apparently that card's fine. That deck doesn't need any help. Next, we're upgrading the Jazz base. Now, I don't know what Overload Shaman needs, because when I looked at the Overload Shaman theory craft I was like, man, I sure am going to play a lot of spells before I die. I didn't have any clear win condition other than I hope I somehow get out for Ragnarai, right? It's really hard to imagine what that archetype needs, as it needs so much. And I'm not convinced that Jazz base is the problem. I could see this going down to 2 mana. I could see this going up to 3 durability. Like, those honestly don't sound like crazy changes to me. I think the functionality of the card, all of the text on it's going to stay identical. I think increasing it to 3 durability allows you to use the weapon more, and this is an archetype that tends to sit on the weapon for a while. It's one of the few things where you're okay not popping the weapon for several turns, whereas stuff like the warrior weapon you're going to sit on at 1 for a very long time intentionally. With the Jazz base, I think you're often waiting much longer than you otherwise would to pop it. I think having an extra durability would in no way be a problem for the card. So I am leaning towards +1 durability. It depends on how the deck loses though, right? I haven't played any Overload Shaman. If the way it loses is consistently that it just dies in the early game, it could go down to 2 mana. And honestly, if you made it a 2-mana 2/3, if this was just Stormforged Axe, with an upside instead of overload, I don't think it would be overpowered. It would be like clearly one of the best cards in the deck, don't get me wrong, it'd be a very, very good card, but I don't think it would suddenly make Overload Shaman insane. So I'm in for either 2 mana or 3 durability, or if they want to go nuts and do both, I'm down for that too. Next up, we've got the Altered Chord, and I'm hard-pressed to tell you what the point of this card is. Control Shaman's not really a thing. You could just drop this to like 4 mana and it would be completely fine. I think that's the change it's going to get, but it still has the same issue of Control Shaman's not real. Control Shaman can't hurt you, and you can't buff Control Shaman enough for it to matter. There are mid-range Shaman decks, and there are combo duplicate Ragnaros Shaman decks, and none of them really have a plan that involves life-stealing and removing for several turns on end, meaning most of them have plans where Altered Chord doesn't fit. That said, making it a 4 mana spell so that it's not just garbage is a way to improve the card quite a lot, right? At 4 mana, it's almost just Death Strike with tremendous upside because it can cost 1 instead. I think at 4 mana, this card is completely fine, and it's actually a good card that threatens to make Control Shaman a good deck down the line when it has support, but not right now. However, there's no reason not to make the buff now. Lightning Storm's getting buffed. It's going to be going down to Overload 1. There's not much debate for what's happening here. I haven't seen Lightning Storm get played since I came back to Hearthstone about 2 months ago. So I had no idea it was still Overload 2. I just assumed it went down to Overload 1 at the same time as Feral Spirits. Apparently it didn't, so now it's going to. Next up, we have Flowrider, and this card is nuts, but it's unplayable as a curve minion is the problem, right? Battle Cry for Overload and discover a spell from your deck, that's just a tutor effect, but better because you're getting to pick from 3 instead of just randomly getting 1, right? So this is a very, very strong effect. 2 mana 3/2 Naga is a fine stat line and tribe, nothing crazy there. The issue is you cannot play this on 2 while being overloaded, because then you won't have 2 mana. So it's actually never a good play on curve, in a deck that's pretty bad against aggro. So yeah, it's a very awkward spot for the deck to live, for the card to live rather. I could see this changing to Battle Cry, discover an overload spell from your deck. Just completely remove the if you're overloaded text. That would make a lot of sense. I think that kind of preserves the same identity without needing a serious rework of the card. If they're not going to do that, if they want to keep it if you're overloaded, it just has to be reimagined as a 1-drop, right? And it doesn't have to be a pushed 1-drop. Like if they want to make it a 1 mana 2/2 and keep the text, that would be a way to get the card playable. But I think the best way to buff this card is to be discover an overload spell from your deck. Or even an overload card, it doesn't really need to be a spell, I guess. But the current identity, having 2-drops that are conditional on not being played as 2-drops is terrible. That's not a good card identity, that needs to change. I think that's what's going to be buffed. Next up we have Crescendo, which I wasn't really expecting to get buffed, but here we are. It says take fatigue damage, deal that much damage to all enemies. You can't be like, deal that much damage plus 1 to all enemies. That's not how Hearthstone cards work. That's not a buff it can get. It could say take fatigue damage twice, right? Like accelerate the fatigue rate your other cards are getting, and that'd be very interesting. But I think realistically, the buff this almost always gets is just 2 mana, right? It just goes down 1 mana cost, because at 3 it's pretty clunky. It's a tempo package, so having a 3 cost AoE tends to mean your turn is terrible unless it's being used for lethal. I see this going down to 2 mana. Next up we have Crazed Conductor, and the only imaginable buff that I've got is this goes up to 5 mana 5/5, right? Increasing its attack is really relevant for fighting on board. There are a lot of things that value trade it. It gets killed by Posic. Like if you play this on curve with Posic being played by your opponent last turn, he just trades for this and gets the bots, and it's a really nasty spot for it to be. But against a lot of different scenarios, having 4 attack is a big downside. There's no reason this couldn't be 5 attack, so let's make it 5 attack. I don't know what other buff you could give it, because with the fatigue cards, changing their text is really, really janky, so it's got to be something else. There's no way it's going down to 4 mana. I briefly considered that and then almost bust out laughing. That would be ridiculous. I guess it could be reimagined though, like go down to a 4 mana 3/4. The issue with that change though is then it's at the same cost as the duplicating imp, so you have a bunch of things at the same mana cost and they're stepping on each other's toes, so I would expect to see the stat line get buffed. Next up you have Siphon Soul. At 5 mana, I could see this going down to 4 mana, but it's also at that point at the same mana as Twisted Tether, which is a very similar effect. I could see its health restore going up to 4 or 5. I would consider like restore health to your hero equal to its attack or health, the destroyed minion I mean. But that's very similar to Cannibalize, so I don't think that change will get made. I think it's most likely just gonna be like restore 5 health to your hero, right? It could go down to 4 mana and that would be fine. I don't really care if Warlock has multiple different assassinated effects at 4 mana. I'd have an issue with it if it were like Death Knights at 5 mana where they have Blood Boil and Corpse Explosion, which are very different effects played around in very different ways that both threaten wide boards just differently. This is just an Assassinate effect on both Twisted Tether and Siphon Soul. so having them both be on 4 mana doesn't really affect anything in terms of playing around it. So I could see it going down to 4, but I'd be more expecting it to go up to just higher health restore at like restore 5 health to your hero. Next up, we've got the Record Scratcher for rogues, and I'm not sure how I'd expect this to get buffed. You can't increase the base amount on the Death Rattle. They all start at 1. That's how the instrument weapons work, so that's not going to be it. Going down to 2 mana is not really helpful because it needs to see all these combos get played to do its job. I'm not entirely convinced that increasing to 3 durability is directly a buff. I think it very often would be, that a lot of the time you sit on this for an extra turn to get more combos under it as you're waiting to set up your combo. The actual combo, not the combo keyword. What an awkward sentence. So while I think that 3 attack would be an unambiguous buff to the card and is quite possible, I'm actually leaning towards 3 durability, which would be symmetrical to the effect change I'm expecting to see on the Jazz base. So I do think this will be going up to 3 durability. Next up, we've got MC Bling Trotties going down to 4 mana. I mean, right now it's Spider Tank plus Hero Power for 5. It is not a very efficient card currently. I don't think there's any reason this should be a 5 mana card. This can just be played at 4 mana. There's no reason for it to be a 5 mana card. You could give it other buffs. You could give the microphones more durability. You could increase his stat line. But to me, the most sensible change is just set it to 4 mana. But like other cards, like Rockmaster Voon at the start, you can make a lot of changes to this guy and have it still not be close to overpowered. So I could very easily be wrong. It might not just be a mana reduction. It could be basically anything. Holy Nova's getting changed yet again. I don't think they'll reduce it to 3 mana because it would be objectively better to Consecrate. So instead, I think they'll be buffing the numbers to deal 3, heal 3, which would make it have a reason to cost more mana than the stuff beneath it. I think if they reduce it to 3, it's just better Consecrate, even though that's fine for different classes that have similar cards at different power levels. I think the devs do still try to avoid doing that. So I expect this to just be buffed to deal 3, heal 3 at 4. Next up, we have Kiri, Chosen Valoon. They could just increase its stats tremendously, but that doesn't really deal with the problem. The problem is this is an effect that is not good enough to justify spending 4 mana on. Giving it a body makes it easier to swallow the pill, but I think much more likely this is changed to a 3 mana 2/2, maybe even a 3 mana 3/3, but at 4 mana this is unplayable, and I think even if you give it a Yeti for a body, it's still not going to be a great card. So I'm really expecting to see this go down in mana, especially because then at least it's not competing. Like, you're not trying to play this over Widowbloom Seedsman, right? At least they're not at the same mana cost anymore, which is why I'm so likely expecting it to go down to 3, rather than just getting hugely buffed at 4. And even at 3, I think it could still stand to be a 3 mana 3/3, it's not a huge problem. But for now, since they're doing a lot of changes and they're prone to doing small iterative changes these days, I'm expecting to see it just go down to 3 mana. Next up, we have the Death Blossom Whomper, and it's really hard for me to nail down what about that card is going to get changed, because, I mean, its text is pretty complete already, right? You can't draw more minions, you can't gain a Death Rattle multiple times. Gaining more stats, I got a 6 mana 7/7, the card's starting to get a little bit overstatted, which is just like a silly way to be powerful, and even then I don't think it would be changing its play rate too much. I think the most likely changes is this drops down to being like a 5 mana 5/6 or a 5 mana 6/6, or it just gains Taunt. Now, I don't think dropping this down to 5 mana is fixing any of the problems that Druid has, because you already have Nourish and the Summer Child on 6, or on 5 rather, right? So going down to 5 mana bloats the slot even further and makes it even harder to run the card. I don't think going down to a 5 mana card is going to make the deck get better. Instead, what I think is going to change is I think they're just going to make this a taunt minion. Because right now, Druid's big issue is that it can't turn the corner consistently enough against aggro decks. So making a duplicating Death Rattle taunt minion, like, yeah, that'd be hella strong. I can imagine this changing the stat line to go with it. But I think if they're making any change to this card, the one most likely to actually cause any effect would be giving it taunt. That probably comes with a stat reduction. It goes down to like 6 or 5 attack. That would be unsurprising. Not that it'll really matter. It'll probably still kill everything that hits it anyway. But I do expect it to lose some attack when it gains taunt. But gaining taunt's tremendously more valuable because of this Death Rattle that you're now forcing your opponent to go through. Next up, we've got nerfs, finally. We're on to the Rowdy Fan. It could just be going down to +3 attack, right? That would be fine. It could also be going down to a 1/4, but that seems like a very arbitrary change that doesn't really affect any of the stuff the card's doing that's powerful. I think most likely they're targeting the attack here because, again, the strongest thing this is doing is giving burn to aggro decks, making this Atheno combo stronger. This is pretty much, in my eyes, just guaranteed to be it has +3 attack while this is alive. Next up, we have Overseer Frigidara, which surprises me because I wasn't expecting to see Frigidara getting a nerf. When I think about what's really strong in Frost Death Knight, I think of Frostwyrm's Fury, and I think of Marrow Manipulator. I don't really think of Frigidara. Don't get me wrong, it's a really good card. There's no reason it can't have 5 health, that would be perfectly reasonable. But I'm not really sure what the effect is going to change to. Deal 1 damage to all enemies wouldn't really matter. I think that, like, actually strips out the identity. I'm guessing it's going to go down tremendously in body size, like a 6-mana 4/4. I think at 5/5, it's not even worth bothering to nerf it. All that does is let you Frostwyrm's Fury this instead of the face. There aren't that many 5 damage targets that didn't already deal with this. I think it's got to go down to like 6-mana 4/4. It's just going to be a tremendously less relevant body. And that doesn't really affect the deck too much, but it does affect the power level a little bit, so it seems reasonable enough. Next up, we've got Twig of the World Tree. This isn't even in Standard. I don't care about this. This did need to be changed. It's a serious problem in Wild now that Druid has weapon tutors and it's not a high roll anymore. But I don't care about this, so I'm not commenting on this. However, our last nerf doesn't have any single card I can point to, because it's just the entire Death Knight class. Which is a weird one. Obviously, the hero power is not getting nerfed. It can't go down to 0 attack. It can't go down to 0 health. It can't not have charge. I guess it could not have charge. It could gain a rush instead. I mean, that's a relevant nerf to stuff like Unholy, where you'll oftentimes summon a charge that gains the Bloodlust effect. So I think that what the change is going to be is it's going to be a rush minion instead of a charge minion. I honestly think that's the change. However, the change I would like to see more would be to make Discover not bullshit. Now, the issue with that is if they can only discover blood cards, then Blood Death Knight actually gets better discover effects. Like, sure, they're never hitting Frostwyrm's Fury anymore, but they are much more consistently hitting Death Strike, Obliterate, Asphyxiate, Blood Boil, Corpse Explosion, and Soul Sealer. Like, all the stuff that's actually blood runes is what Blood Knight wants the most. And the same is true with Frost or Frost. They would only nerf Unholy, but actually buff the other two if we completely restricted discover effects like that. They could restrict discover effects based on the number of runes, like maybe just tri-rune cards aren't discoverable at all. That would be an idea to toy with. But I don't know why I'm even entertaining the idea. I feel like they've already dug their grave and they're just gonna lie in it now. I don't feel like they have any interest in changing it for several expansions. It's gonna reduce the hero power to rush. I can dream about making Discover less effective. They're just gonna make the hero power into a rush minion instead of a charge minion though. That's all they're gonna change. And like, yeah, that does mean your aggro decks have a little bit less damage over the course of a match. It means that you have less burst with stuff like Rowdy Fan and Grave Strength than you used to. But most of all, it doesn't really do anything. That's not a super impactful nerf, and I don't think it matters at all. I would much rather see an effect like you can no longer discover tri-rune cards. That would prevent Soul Stealers, Frostwyrm's Fury, and Grave Strength. Those are essentially the reasons you play those classes. Vampiric Blood is also tri-rune. So is Marrow Manipulator. There are a lot of really, really high impact cards at 3 rune, and I think that removing those is probably just fine. It does come with the weird caveat of it's kind of weird that a Frost Death Knight can't discover more Frostwyrm's Furies. I don't know. I can't think of a rules clean way of making Discover work for Death Knights. It just feels like a band-aid to a bad decision, and it's going to take a lot to unfuck the decision that is Death Knight Discover effects. So yeah, the minion gains rush now instead of charge, and that's it. Okay, so final statement after thinking about all of this for a good long while. I hope that I'm wrong about the buffs and nerfs that are coming. And the reason is because if I'm right, if I'm even close to right, I don't think any of this is going to change the meta, man. I think it's all going to stay pretty much exactly as it is. I don't think adding Kiri to Druid decks is going to change much. This card, getting Taunt, could be massive for Druids. That could propel them pretty high up. Control Warrior getting remotely viable tools would help them, but they don't have a win condition. It doesn't matter. All of the buffs of these other cards are buffs or archetypes that are so dead, it's not going to be close to enough to get them functioning. So if I'm remotely right about what this balance patch looks like, this is a whole lot of changes that I think will have literally next to no impact on the meta. Like, you'll see some deck changing in tier 3 and tier 4, like in the fringe decks that don't actually matter. And you'll see a minor power reduction in Frost especially, and in Syntheno combo Demon Hunter decks. But aside from that, like, this doesn't do anything, right? This is so minor. So yeah, I really, really hope I'm wrong in this prediction, because if I'm close to right, these balance changes won't fix anything. Oh wait, actually, let's go check the comment threads. I haven't read anything other people were theory crafting. let's see if anyone else has some interesting stuff to say about this before I wrap up. So I went over to the teaser thread on competitive Hearthstone, and this is a big tweet. It is not a hero power nerf. Holy shit, that's massive. That's so much more important. That's great news. That means it is almost certainly a discover change, and they can't completely restrict it by runes. So I'm gonna guess that tricolor runes are only available if you have those in your actual deck, right? In my mind, that feels like the best band-aid fix available, but I really don't know what it's going to be, because it's sort of a nightmare to think about because they've dug this grave for themselves. I don't know how to get them out of it. Hopefully they do, though. It is their jobs, not mine, after all. Twig is banned. I really like that prediction. That's a pretty easy solution to the problem. Oh yeah, Thori could just have infinite revives. That's a good point. Apparently Thori is a rural municipality in the Parsa district in province number 2 in Nepal. Thanks. So I do like the idea of Thori having infinite revives. It doesn't seem like it really matters. You're limited by the number of fire spells in your deck anyway. Generally, this guy and I seem to be about on the same page. Rowdy Fan only grants +2 attack, I think is a little bit more than it'll get. Getting stat buffs to compensate does make sense. That would probably be a more balanced card overall, so I actually like his interpretation of the Rowdy Fan nerf much more than my own. Splitter to a 2-mana 3/2 would be a huge buff to the card. That's actually really, really good. I was thinking that it doesn't matter if it drops down in mana cost, who cares? But a 2-mana 3/2 is much better than a 3-mana 4/3. Additionally, there are not enough good mechs in the 2-drop for Mage. That would be a much, much more impactful buff than I was realizing it would be. Because legitimately, when I tried to put more mechs in my 2-drop slot for Mech Mage, I was looking at a Noyotron like, shit, there's no other options. I know I'm an aggressive deck that's trying to burn them out with volume up, but a Noyotron's the only 2-cost mech I've got, so this is actually probably the buff. Brightwing effects cards in hand and deck is the other thing I was really looking at, but I still don't think it's that, because if it was that, they should be giving the exact same buff to Black Rock and Roll. The fact that they aren't would be upsetting to me, so I'm assuming they're doing something else. This guy's on the 3 attack for both boat as opposed to the 3 durability for both boat. I'm interested to see which one of us is right. Whoa, that's a radical prediction. He's expecting Whomper to go down 2 whole mana to 4 mana, as opposed to reducing in mana a little bit or gaining taunt or anything like that. He's expecting it to be a much smaller minion. And that actually makes sense, because at 5 mana, like I was saying, it's competing with Nourish and Summerchild. But at 4 mana, yeah, it's competing with Blood Bloom Seasman, of course. But now it's a small enough minion coming out fast enough that you don't need it to have taunt. So I actually think this is much more likely than taunt. I just wasn't looking at reducing it in cost by that much. This guy's hit the nail on the head for why I'm not confident in just buffing Stranglethorn Heart's mana cost. You have to play it on turn 10 anyway. You need your expensive beast to have died to play it. Even if you can play it on 8, maybe 1 expensive beast has died at that point, right? Like, it's still not doing anything. This guy's actually pretty right about this. Miracle is looking a lot scarier. All we're nerfing is Atheno combos and Frost Death Knight, really? That is explicitly the stuff that is keeping Miracle Rogue in check, isn't it? Huh. That's very scary. I think it's really funny that people are like, 25 buffs is way too much. There's no way to know what the meta will look like. Dude, they release expansions. They're changing 25 cards. Last month, not even last month, like 3 weeks ago, they released 125 cards. What are we talking about? They shake the game up way more than this all the time. This man is out here telling me that Mech Mage's worst matchup is not Blood Death Knight, and I'm really interested in that. Because I feel like Mech Mage against Blood DK is an auto-loss matchup where you have no win condition. Oh no! I forgot Light Show was in the game and it didn't get a buff. That's so sad. I'm not sure how you buff Light Show, because at 2 mana the card seems like it might be busted, and at 3 mana it's completely unplayable. Oh, that's so sad. Alright, I'm done for real now. It's been fun thinking about this. Thursday, the patch will come out and we'll get to see what's actually changing, but until then, waiting with bated breath. I would really like to see the top meta shake up a lot. But honestly, even with other people being skeptical about seeing a 25 card buff list, I look at this and I don't actually see a huge net change unless this Death Knight change has way more impact than I'm predicting it to. Because honestly, I don't think it will have that huge of an impact, all things told. Hopefully I'm wrong though. I really hope this shakes things up quite a lot. But for now, I've been Rather Incoherent, and I'm done speculating. I'll see you next time when the patch actually hits, and we'll talk about it then. If you liked the video, like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff really does help the channel out, and I'll see you in the next one.